What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Comparative Politics. I hope that you're doing really well and that you've had a good week. As you know, we are right smack dab in the middle of a conversation about authoritarian regimes. And we've been discussing different types of authoritarian regime. We began with the ruling monarchies, and we distinguished them from traditional monarchies. Remember that our discussion began with this kind of comparison of democratic and authoritarian regimes and kind of their broad differences. And what I like to do today is, before we get started continuing that discussion about types of regimes, I want to go back and actually discuss a current event that ties directly into this distinction between democratic and authoritarian regimes that we identified. And the current event comes from a comment made by President Trump during a press conference yesterday, where he was asked if he would commit here today for a peaceful transfer of power after the November election. And President Trump responded by saying, there won't be a transfer, frankly, there will be a continuation. And this comment, it might escape scrutiny if we don't think too much about it. But if we think about it in the context of the different dimensions of contestation that we identified, it becomes more meaningful. And as you'll recall, we identified three types of dimensions of contestation. First, uncertainty. Second, irreversibility. And third, repeatability. And what I'd like to do is have a conversation where we identify which dimension of contestation this would violate if Trump actually went through with what he said. Let's talk about this, and let's talk about how we know which dimension is relevant here in this comment. You can use the mic, you can also use the chat, but let's sit back for a moment and think about this and put it in the context of our lesson from Tuesday. Does anyone want to take the floor and make a comment about which dimension this comment implicates?
I believe it implicates that we're pretty much no longer a democracy. That the reason why this country is so great is because we're democratic and that we believe in voting and we believe in transfer of power if one does win those votes. But since this comment really does make me, it brings a little sense of fear into me because I believe that not only did a lot of people come to this country because of that main idea of democracy and the belief that you can pursue happiness. And yeah, I just believe it's a little absurd, honestly. It takes away all the main ideas of our country and, the foundation of it. So yeah, that's what I believe.
So Caesar, this issue of the transfer of power, which of these three dimensions do you think that ties closely to? You're right on the issue of the transfer of power and how this might affect the democratic fundamentals. Is there a particular dimension here that you think is most closely related to that?
Probably the repeatability one.
Okay, so let's get some more input here. Can we discuss these different dimensions and maybe review what they mean so that we can make sense of this? Repeatability, remember, usually relates to whether or not elections occur frequently and so, according to some sort of set schedule. And so in this case, the election is still going to happen, and Trump doesn't appear to be saying that the election won't happen. So repeatability might not be as closely related as maybe uncertainty or irreversibility. Can we get some more voices here? Can we discuss this a little further? If we don't think that it's repeatability, do we think that it's uncertainty or irreversibility that's most at stake here?
Wouldn't it be irreversibility? Because if Biden actually wins the election, but Trump won't let him take office, irreversibility talks about the person who wins actually taking office.
Yes, absolutely, Stephen. And so the idea of irreversibility is to say, well, if the election outcome is reversible, if the incumbent can just remain in power, even if he loses the election, we don't have irreversibility of the kind that we need to have contestation that characterizes a democratic regime. And so to combine Caesar and Stephen's points, the democratic regime would be at stake in the sense that if we reverse the outcome of the election and Trump remains in power despite losing the election, we don't have the irreversibility and the transfer of power that need to characterize the regime. And so this is a comment that may seem on its face somewhat benign, but if we look more closely, we can see plain and simple that it does implicate the democratic regime, and it does suggest that irreversibility may be at stake. Now, on the other hand, if Trump were to permit Biden to take power, and if he were to transfer power peacefully after losing the election, that would be an example of irreversibility in the sense that the incumbent passed power to the new elected government. Of course, maybe Trump will win the election, and this will be a moot point, and it won't be an issue. But it's unclear what the electoral outcome will be at this point because he is trailing in most polls. So Stephen and Caesar's points together highlight the sort of quandary and the kind of problem here for democracy in the United States. If we don't have irreversibility, we can't have democracy. And what that means in practice is that we must have a transfer of power if the incumbent government loses the election. What else can we say to this discussion? This is such a loaded conversation, and we can have a variety of perspectives here that are equally valid. Does anyone think that President Trump's comment was insincere, or was he just kind of trolling? What do you all think?
I think for this election, so with the dimensions first, I think it's most of an ex ante uncertainty because like we don't know the outcomes of the election. So because of his statement saying that there won't be a transfer, frankly, it kind of raises the question of whether he will accept the possible defeat because of like basically who knows what's gonna happen on election night, and also basically like let's say that he were to be reelected, a lot of people would think that because of this comment, like they'll try and say that he possibly, like basically in the 2016 election, that he collided with Russia or like any like basically accusations. So this is kind of more of the question of whether he like the polls and like were correct, or like whether the or whether there was voter suppression, or whether like people's like ballots were casted, because in the past he has said that he would like cast out people's votes, which is kind of alarming. But at the same time, it's like who knows, maybe he is like just like messing around, or like basically like we don't know his like statements.
Efren, that's such a great point. The more I think about it, I also see uncertainty being implicated here because, as you point out, he's already talked about, sort of like rigging the election almost, like throwing out ballots, behaving in a way that creates that uneven playing field, and that makes it seem like maybe we know the electoral outcome before the election actually happens because of these games. And to your point, is he trolling or not? I don't know. Is he just farting in an elevator and like leaving with this comment, or is he like for real about what he might actually do? It's difficult to say because, like many of you, I detest this man, for me to get real with you, but sometimes I don't know if he's serious. I don't even know if he knows what he's saying. And frankly, I think that there are questions about whether he's competent enough to do this kind of a thing as well. And with all due respect to him, however little respect he deserves, there are some questions about what will actually happen. But this is, I think, right on point. Like uncertainty could also be at stake as well as irreversibility. Efren points that out, and the more I think about it, I think that they're both at stake. Although I did originally think that maybe irreversibility was sort of the issue that seemed to be most related to this comment. Are there other insights or other perspectives here that we want to share before we continue?
Yes, I have a question. What about if the winning coalition make him win the elections?
Yeah, so if he wins the election fair and square, then he wins the election, right? And in which case, these considerations might be irrelevant. It's possible that he will win the election, and he may have enough support in swing states. But on the topic of the winning coalition, I'm so happy to hear you using that language from the reading. The winning coalition could be big enough for him to win, right? And in the electoral outcome from that perspective does sort of remain uncertain. But we might also wonder if the various, things that he's done, the gerrymandering, the messing with the ballots, the policies to slow down the post office, it makes you wonder if some of those things might compromise that uncertainty and compromise the integrity of that victory. But the winning coalition could be large enough to help him win. This is true. And we'll discuss what that means later in the course, or later in today's class. But these are all things that we want to think about, and the politics of this matters too, which is that, look, people need to go and vote whomever they support, and hopefully we can have an outcome that is a valid outcome that doesn't undermine the democratic integrity of the institutions. And so we can hope for, I think, a good election, and maybe a clean election, and maybe an outcome that is respected by both parties, regardless of what that outcome is. Are there other points of view on this issue before we continue?
Can I add something to that?
Yes, you can, Rady.
So in my opinion, what I think he tried to say is that he's so sure of his victory in November that he basically say that there will be like a peaceful transfer, like instead of there's gonna be a continuity, right? That's like one of the things that I think he said. But I also think that just like it happened back in 2016 with the transfer of power, it was not a peaceful transfer of power, in a sense that people did not accept the transfer of power, and they started like protesting and rioting and destroying stuff. Like it could be the same situation this year in 2020 November, right? It could be the same. It is already like that. Like some people are mixing the Black Lives Matter movement with like the Democratic Party. Some of them are using the situation to riot, to destroy the country, right? And it is a sad situation, but it can also be mixed with the 2020 election, right? And yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, so I thought long and hard about that too. And I also considered that interpretation, the idea that he's not actually addressing the question. What he's saying is that, look, I'm going to win, and so it's going to be irrelevant, the question of the transfer of power. But that interpretation being valid, we have to also think about the context of the question, which was the reporter was asking. He said, assume that you lose the election. Can you commit to a peaceful transfer of power given that context? And that was the context in which Trump made this comment. And so it's hard to know, right? Like, did he mean to say, like, look, I'm going to win and your question is irrelevant? Or did he literally say, like, no, I won't hand over power? I think it's possible that he did mean I'm going to win the election and it will become irrelevant, in which case maybe this discussion is not a relevant discussion. But if we go with the other interpretation, which is that he understood the question in the context, it is kind of troubling, even objectively speaking, putting aside our feelings or our distaste for the man. But to your second point regarding the peaceful transfer of power, so what that usually means in this context is like the willingness of the actors themselves, like the incumbent government and the newly elected government, like the willingness of those actors to transfer power in a way that is peaceful and with integrity, and that doesn't involve antagonism or discontent or sort of hostile relationships. Like, for example, if it takes 6 months for the incumbent to pass power to the new government, that's not really a peaceful transfer of power. We don't really mean, for instance, like whether there are protests at a local level. There are usually protests around election time for whatever reason. And so that's kind of just a feature of civil society in a democracy. People express themselves. What we mean is like whether the elites themselves are willing to pass power in a peaceful way, and that, doesn't slow down the process of governance or so on and so forth. So a peaceful transfer in this case would be, January, 20th comes around, and assuming Trump loses, he hands power over to Biden without challenging the outcome. If he challenged the outcome and delayed that process, that would be considered not peaceful. But Rady, your point is really valid, and I'm happy that we're interpreting this in a variety of ways, because it can be interpreted in different ways. And he is so headstrong that he does usually insist that regardless of what will happen, he's going to simply win. But we can also interpret that again a different way, which is to say, well, maybe he's trying to affect the uncertainty of the outcome, or even to reverse the outcome, as Stephen suggested. So we've got different perspectives here. And what I'm so happy about is that you all are thinking through the lenses of these different dimensions of contestation. Remember that uncertainty meant, is the election outcome unknown before it happens? Irreversibility meant, does the winner of the election actually take office? And repeatability meant, do elections occur at regular and known intervals? And what I had is that this comment implicates irreversibility. But to the other points made, I think that uncertainty might be at stake here as well. If we go with the interpretation that Trump is saying he won't hand over power if he loses, if we go with the interpretation that he's going to win no matter what, this discussion might not be relevant, in which case maybe Trump is a Democrat, a small d Democrat, not a big D Democrat, in the sense that he would be respecting the integrity of the rules. But the point that I want to also make to you is that this is a debate, right? There's no answer to this question that is correct or incorrect. There are multiple perspectives on this man, and you know, the sort of significance of his administration and his political behavior. And before we continue, I actually want to pan out a little bit further even and address a related question, which is Trump a threat to democracy? This is a more blunt question, and I want you to answer it equally bluntly. The context of this question is that Trump has made these comments for a long time. This is not new, actually. He's always talked about retaining power beyond legal limits. He made the comment about how, like in China, we should permit him to be president for life. He talked about potentially staying in office longer than 2 terms by changing the rules. He made comments about making executive orders that would prevent Biden from running so that he wouldn't have an opponent. And I'm wondering, you know, is he farting in an elevator, or is he just real about this? Is he actually a threat to democracy in the ways that might implicate those different dimensions of contestation? Or is he not? Is he just kind of a phony when it comes to these comments? What do you think?
Oh, can I go?
Yes, Efren.
Actually, I think someone was gonna go. Wait. Yeah.
Was there someone else?
Yes, but later.
Oh, yeah, Anna Martha, please.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can go.
Anna Martha?
Okay. I think he's a threat for not just the Democrat. I guess he's a threat for all the human beings. This guy, he's crazy, okay? But nobody take him seriously, because I guess he's losing his mind already. But I'm afraid, actually, I feel more insecure because he can win. That's I am afraid that. Okay, that's my opinion. Thank you.
Oh, Anna Martha, that connects to your point that you made about the winning coalition, right? Like, and I think
Yes.
that's completely valid, right? Like, he could win. He could win fair and square as a result of like the nature of the weather on election day or something. And so, from that perspective, I think that you're totally like rightful in having that fear. And I think that the point about being a threat to the world is totally valid, right? With regard to climate change and, you know, the support or lack thereof for the World Health Organization and stuff like this. These are things that are really palpable and that affect us every day, and not just us, but everywhere. You know, our families and people all over the world. Efren, do you want to take the mic?
Yeah, I'm just making sure no one like comes back so I don't interrupt anyone. So I'm gonna take it from like both stances because like I'm a neutral person. So some people that oppose him say that he can be a threat because of all the comments and all like the demonstration that he has imposed in the United States, for instance, with the Black Lives Matter movement. Like even though it was a freedom of speech movement near the White House, he did have some very aggressive approaches just to take a photo op for political actions. But at the same time, his supporters can also see this as like his supporters basically think this is a pride of nationalism because some in the past, like people may want to increase the United States as a very like strong and like very like serious nation because of his policies. But however, like it's difficult to answer this because like there's like a lot of perspectives of whether like this is a true like threat to democracy. So it's like it can go either way. It's like there's no one clear answer. It's like there's a lot of factors that incorporate to President Trump being a threat to democracy.
I agree. I agree. And we'll talk later in the course about some country experiences that are much more sobering than ours, and cases that do demonstrate a reversal of democracy. But I think to your other position, it is possible that it could get worse, right? We do have questions about the way the election will go and whether the outcome will be respected, and it could get worse. And as we often say, things often have to get worse before they get better. And what that will look like here is sort of an open question. And what I want you to realize is that this is a pivotal moment in history. This is a moment in time that we can't step outside of right now, but you'll know in the future that this was a moment, a critical moment that could go multiple ways. We're really at a crossroads here. And, we have a variety of perspectives, and that's important and healthy, but this is a critical time like no other in recent memory. Before we continue, let's hear from some others on this question of whether Trump is a threat to democracy. We have a variety of opinions, and all of those are valid, and we can make good arguments on both sides.
Can I go?
Yes.
When it comes to thinking about if Trump is a threat to democracy, I would say that it is very possible. Mostly based on the fact that when it comes to making decisions on like big like world problems, there's usually no action from his side of like his, what's it called?
Administration.
There you go. And then when it comes to things that people want change for, it's like you usually don't see action for those things. It's just he takes action of the things that people are against or people don't find fair to like everyone. So it's like when it comes to furthering his presidency, I believe that the world could be a threat to whatever powers he believes he's going to have in the future.
Yes. So I know you're not Miguel. I think you were calling in through someone else's. Can you remind us of your name, please?
Oh, Miguel Payan.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me. I thought I remembered someone calling in from a different line. So they were using someone else's line from a previous class. My bad.
Oh, sorry.
Marissa says, I think he is a threat to democracy. His comments of being president forever, wanting to change rules of the election and having little empathy for opponents, stating that there are good people on both sides when white supremacists were attacking in Charlottesville. I could be wrong on this city. Whether or not he is being serious or not, comments like this make threats to democracy. So he does talk a lot about extending his rule beyond legal limits. And those comments do alarm us a great deal because that would undermine the contestation in the ways that we discussed. And Miguel agrees with that and is seconding that perspective. Before we continue, are there other comments or perspectives that we'd like to share?
Could I add on to what I forgot who it was in the chat, Marissa said?
Yes, Sophia.
I think, at least for me, I think he's a little bit of a threat. We do live in a country where there's 3 branches of government that check each other. So I think sometimes he likes to say things to get a reaction out of people, but then he kind of does things like behind the scenes that like not a lot of people focus on. So sometimes I think he's just like, it's just an act. Like, I don't think he's being like, he could possibly be serious, but I think like it's honestly just a distraction.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's possible too, and I considered that, and he's really such a he just kind of incites, right? He's hyperbolic, and he's often trying to be sort of provocative for the sake of being provocative, and sometimes he may not be sincere, but as long as he has this support and what appears to be a potential winning coalition, as Anna Martha said, it's difficult to know whether he could really carry out what he says he's willing to do. And so I think that that's the concern that we have. And in some ways, the support that he might have politically could make it possible for him to undermine the institutions in ways that would seem more valid. And Rady says he wants to have all of the attention. This is certainly true. He wants the attention. Maybe he's making these comments for that reason. Let's pick up where we left off last time and continue discussing the types of authoritarian regime. And before we continue, let's just take a look at one case that also involves a continuation of a certain government or a certain type of government. And so this is the case of continued authoritarianism in Belarus. So the current president there, Alexander Lukashenko, has been in power since 1994. And Lukashenko is notable because he built an autocratic and personal regime with support from Russia. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, Belarus essentially remained within the Russian sort of sphere, and the form of regime resembles that as well. In Belarus, the opposition is intimidated. There are a lot of political prisoners. Civil society is repressed. And in general, the playing field is far from level. Elections, for example, are a sham. And although elections do occur, they don't carry the quality of uncertainty, and they're often reversible even. But that's not an issue typically because they're always rigged. The election outcomes are always rigged. And so one thing about Belarus that's notable and that you have to keep in mind with respect to all authoritarian regimes is that they often do have elections. The presence of elections itself is not just a characteristic of democracy. In fact, most authoritarian regimes try to legitimate their rule with elections. It's just that the elections are a sham and the outcomes are usually rigged. And for instance, in some cases, they'll win like 95% of the vote, just impossible proportions of the vote. But they have these elections to try to legitimate their rule and create the illusion of democracy. This takes us to the second type of authoritarian rule, which is a military regime. And this is where the military directly or indirectly controls political decisions. This is a type of regime that is typically more conservative and focused on maintaining order and establishing or restoring stability, oftentimes in a context of crisis, economic or political or foreign policy related. These are usually less personalized. We don't often see a single individual emerge as sort of a sole power holder within one of these regimes. It's usually like a set of generals representing different services who share power. And we call this a junta. That's the institutional form taken by most military regimes. And these regimes are temporary. They don't last very long. Usually they're a few years, maybe a decade at the very most. In some cases, they last for half a century, like in Myanmar or Burma, as we also call it. But that's actually very unusual. The truth is that the military is usually interested in ruling temporarily so that they can restore order and maybe reset political relationships in a way that is advantageous to them or their allies, often in conservative parties. The military doesn't rule that much anymore. Only about a dozen countries today have a military regime, and those include like Thailand, Egypt. There are some other examples, but it's not very common. It hasn't always been that way, though. The military ruled in about a third of all developing countries, including in Africa and Latin America, during the 1970s. This was a period that was characterized by a deep economic crisis, and there were foreign policy crises and conflicts throughout the world that centered on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the military was deeply involved at this time in intervening in politics so as to suppress communist threats or perceived threats and to reset and restore political order in the face of crisis that would be brought on by like economic crises or political crises. Military regimes are distinctive because they typically emerge only under certain circumstances. The military isn't ordinarily interested in ruling for its own sake. Usually the military is interested in ruling on behalf of some social class or for the purpose of restoring order or protecting the state in a way that would be advantageous to the military, but they don't normally have an agenda of their own. There are some important exceptions, including in Latin America in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, but by and large, these regimes are more temporary. they can take two forms. On the one hand, there's open military rule, where the military takes power through a coup. And this is the most self-evident form. This is the kind where you see tanks in the streets, in some cases, not always, but there's also disguised military rule. And this is more insidious. This is where the military controls the civilian government from behind the scenes, and where the civilian government is sort of like a puppet. It makes its decisions in response to the military outlining acceptable decisions, or creating the agenda. And this is evident in some Latin American cases in the 90s and the 2000s, and also some African cases. Kevin says, I think FDR shows that that is less likely to happen. How do you mean? I think Kevin is referring to the way that FDR was elected like 4 times because he was so popular, and they had to change the rules and limit re-election for presidents to 2 terms, because otherwise he would have just been re-elected and re-elected over and over again. Interestingly enough, FDR was pretty much a socialist for his time in America. So interesting that he was so popular and persisted in power for so long. Now, obviously the context supported his re-election as well, but he was very skillful at responding to the context in serving the needs of people at that time. So let's take a look at some examples of military regimes. First, we'll start in South America. South America is synonymous with military rule because most of the most vicious military regimes and most repressive regimes took place in Latin American countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile. And the context of this is closely tied to the economic and political circumstances in those countries. In the 1930s and 1960s, during that period, the Latin American economies grew very, very steadily and very robustly. But by the 60s and the 70s, the economic model that they had depended on for that growth was exhausted, and it sort of had run its course, so to speak. And economic crises of inflation, debt crises began to spiral. And in general, the economies began to contract and slow down in their growth. And in response, there was a lot of popular unrest because people were negatively affected by falling prices and falling wages, inflation, etc. In the 1970s and 1980s, the military intervened and promoted pro-elite economic policies that were set and designed to kind of not just restore order, but protect some of the interests that had been negatively affected by the economic crisis and the economic model of the previous decades. And they were also extremely repressive. So in Argentina, for example, the military disappeared 20,000 people in the space of about 9 years. They used torture and vicious tactics to hunt down perceived communists and basically disappear them and bury them in large unmarked graves, or drop them from helicopters into the ocean with bricks tied to their feet and stuff like that. This happened throughout Latin America, and the military regimes were principally in place to reset and restore order and sort of subdue what was viewed as a communist threat, both by the United States and the militaries in those countries. Now, they also had the idea that they were better than the civilians at ruling. And so they were willing to stand in for them, and often viciously so, to the point of killing many sitting presidents, not many, but some. So for example, Allende in Chile, who was killed when the presidential palace was burned down on the day of the coup. These are just some examples and some details that put in context how vicious the military regimes were. There also are more contemporary military regimes. In 2014 in Thailand, for example, the military seized power in a coup. And the same day, I remember reading the article, the news release, the same day they came out and said that we promised to promptly hold elections and return power to a democratically elected civilian government. Now, at the time, there was a deep political crisis in the country, and basically a family whose descendants had long won elections handily also appeared poised to win again, and the military didn't like this person, and so they took power for themselves. And still today, the military remains in power, and it's held by a retired army general and dictator Prayut Chan-o-cha. And this is an example of a contemporary military regime that came to power in a context very much like the context in Latin America: political crisis, popular unrest. So obviously Evo Morales is a controversial figure, and his legacy is controversial as well. Referring to the chat and the discussion taking place in the chat, the third type of authoritarian regime is what we call one-party authoritarianism, and this is a form that is less common and more durable than military rule, and its origins are in the revolution or misappropriation of power by parties who usually emerge from a revolution victorious, or who have a leading role in carrying out some political transformation or prevailing in some conflict. So these often can come out of like civil wars. They can come out of political or social revolutions. They're less common, but they are more durable, and it's because they're more institutionalized. And what that means is that they do more to sort of recreate the structure of power and the structure of government to their advantage. And these can be open or disguised as well, but they tend to be open because the most important variety is the communist regime. And the communist regime is a very visible regime in the sense that the communist parties in those cases engage in what we call organizational parallelism. And this is basically organizational rule by Communist Party organs that are set up to mirror the organs of the state. So for every department or bureaucracy or agency within the state, there is a department or bureaucracy or agency created within the party itself to sort of mirror the state and create this sense of organizational parallelism or organizational rule. So this is really, really structural and institutionalized. They do a lot to kind of recreate the structure of power in a way that is advantageous to the party. And this is how they stay in power for so long. They stay in power for so long by creating that parallel structure of power and then inhabiting it and really monopolizing the state through the party. And so the most common type, as I mentioned, is obviously the communist one-party regime. These were really common in the 1970s. There were 20 of them at the time. Today, there are really only 3 that still survive. Those include China, Vietnam, Laos. One thing that's interesting is that though these parties often do begin as communist parties, both in their politics and their economic policy, they often will sort of adapt their economic policy in ways that can create new gains for the party, even while the party remains a putatively communist party. So for example, China, the one-party authoritarian regime that exists in China began as a fully authoritarian, fully communist regime where the state owned everything and the party was engaged in the sort of monopolization of a state that owned and controlled the entire economy. But today in China, it's really more of a mixed economy. Although there still is a role for central planning and most large enterprises are still owned by the state, there's been substantial economic liberalization in China compared to where they began. Same thing in Vietnam, maybe even more so in Vietnam. What began as an entirely sort of statist, state-controlled economy is now increasingly a more hybrid or mixed type. And what's interesting is that shows that the parties are actually able to adapt economic policies and political and economic institutions in ways that can help to create new gains or advantages for the party while still retaining control over the political system. Laos is another example. And Africa is also a region that has seen numerous one-party regimes, mostly that emerged from decolonization. And there's a reason for that, because decolonization involves a decolonization struggle. And there's usually a conflict or some sort of tension that plays out within these places. And there's an important role for political parties or movements that represent the opposition to colonization and the support for decolonization. So when decolonization takes place, those parties are often the ones that are able to sort of rise to the top and monopolize power. And so that's why we saw that both in Africa as well as in some of those cases in Asia too. So let's take a look at the case of Vietnam, which is really interesting because of how extensive the organizational parallelism here is. So in Vietnam, all political organizations are under the Communist Party's control. Everything falls under the Communist Party. There's not a single entity or organization that doesn't fall within that umbrella. And so they exert control over basically all political activity in organization. There's also the top 4 positions in the Politburo being held by the party general secretary, the general minister of public security, and the state president, and the prime minister. So the Politburo is basically the head decision-making unit, and those positions are held by the party leaders, or the sort of elites within the party, and also the prime minister, who of course comes from the party as well. And so there's this monopolization of political institutions within the state, the institutions themselves being designed to accommodate the party's leadership. And then the party secretariat consists of 8 Politburo members, and it oversees the day-to-day implementation. So notice that there's this like cross-fertilization. Party members and party leaders who are office holders within the party monopolize positions within the state. And then there's also a sort of reverse monopolization where the party secretariat itself consists of members of the state. Now they're all from the same party, right? So it's almost moot to even distinguish between the two. But this is the point. The whole point is that the party monopolizes the state and creates institutions that parallel state organs, and then helps the party to solidify its control through those organs. And so Vietnam is a good case. China is another example. Laos is another example. Of course, this is common elsewhere too. The case of Mexico is also a case of one-party authoritarianism. Now, not still today, basically from 1929 to 2000. And this was when the Institutional Revolution Party ruled continuously through electoral control, vote rigging, patronage, corruption. A common thing in Mexico is purchasing the support of peasants and working class and poor people by giving them chicken or rice or drugs or beer in exchange for their vote. Sometimes they just pay them. But these are some of the common tactics that the party used in Mexico to retain control. And like in other countries that epitomize one-party rule, this party emerged from the Mexican Revolution. So there's a pattern here that I want you to notice, which is that those parties that are best equipped and best poised to exert control over a political system and institute a one-party authoritarian regime are the same parties that were strong enough to sort of emerge victorious from moments of unrest or conflict or revolution within countries. And so it's almost like to the victor go the spoils. These revolutions or these conflicts domestically produce a loser and a winner, or produce parties that are more or less advantaged by the outcome of the revolution. And those who come out on top are able to sort of take power for themselves and monopolize the rest of the state. Mexico is one example, but there are some other examples from Latin America that are relevant too, but there are fewer examples from Latin America because most of Latin America had fallen to military regimes and military coups. And so though parties are important in Mexico, Mexico hasn't had an important role for the military. It typically has been the PRI who's been the sort of dominant actor. The fourth type of authoritarian regime is what we call theocratic authoritarianism. And this is direct or indirect rule by religious authorities. And in this situation, leaders claim divine guidance to hold the authority to rule. They basically say that God has anointed them the sort of dictator, right? They have the divine right to hold the power to rule, and they get that divine right from God themselves. And so this divinity, this sort of guidance, if you will, helps to legitimate them and helps to sort of support what is a very complex institutional framework. And it's complex because it's religious rule. And so the rule and the framework is decisively shaped by the interpretation of the dominant religion within that theocratic authoritarian regime. Now, all of the modern examples are Islamic examples of Islamic rule. Sudan, Iran since 1979, Afghanistan under the Taliban. There have been some other cases, but as far as I know, all of the modern examples are examples of Islamic rule. And again, it's complex because of this overlap between sort of religious authority and political authority. And the divine right to rule comes from this supposed relationship with with God or the divinity that is had by the leaders who are able to claim this power. And so this is a unique form of authoritarian regime that is different than the other forms. And one question that comes up is, how is it that Saudi Arabia is not an example of theocratic authoritarianism? Remember that Islam has an important role in Saudi Arabia, and part of the legal code, if not all of it, is informed by Sharia law. And Sharia law, for example, as we saw in the video, makes it possible to justify, or this interpretation of Sharia law, I should say, makes it possible to justify public hangings and public killings of people who've been found guilty of stealing things or just whatever. We saw that in the video. I'm not, making that up. The question, though, is why is Saudi Arabia not an example of theocratic authoritarianism? What makes it a monarchy instead of a theocratic authoritarian regime? Does anyone want to take on that question?
What was the question again?
Why is it that Saudi Arabia is not a theocratic authoritarian regime? How is it that they don't qualify as a theocratic authoritarian regime if Islam has an important role in Sharia law?
I believe you mentioned that it's because they don't use the divine right, or this idea that they are entitled to power due to their religious affiliation, and it's more of a familiar line in terms of the process.
Totally. Yeah, it's all about descent, right? Like the familial line of descent and the kind of the sort of royal family focus, right? It's all about the family and passing power from father to son, father to daughter, I suppose, theoretically, but in this situation in Saudi Arabia, it's always been men who control those 13 provinces. Kevin says they are a monarch, that's by blood. Yeah, good. So it's an important distinction, right? Though Sharia law is the form of law and order used by Saudi Arabia, the leaders themselves do not claim a divine right to rule. Instead, what they claim is blood of kin, right? The sort of familial line, as Alexis put it, the familial line of descent, and the way that creates and justifies. Sorry, everybody, I'm getting a bunch of phone calls. In the way that justifies the selection of certain leaders. So there's an important distinction there. It's all about leadership selection. Are those leaders selected because they claim a divine right to guide, to claim a divine right to rule, or are they selected because they are in the familial line of descent, as Alexis put it? And in Saudi Arabia, they're selected because of that familial line of descent. But in Iran, it's the opposite. Iran is an example where the leaders are selected based upon their divine right to rule, or their claim to a divine right to rule. And what that means is their sort of elite status as religious leaders, not necessarily as political leaders. They are political leaders because they are first and foremost religious leaders. And so the case of Iran helps to illustrate this in all of its detail. And so in Iran, the supreme leader, Khomeini, is the most important figure of all. The supreme leader is a religious official, but he's also the sort of political, the political don, if you will. He is the dictator for all intents and purposes. And the supreme leader is the commander-in-chief of all of the military. He's also basically in charge of appointing the main clerics on the Guardian Council, which is the judicial body. He can dismiss the president, and he oversees the president. He appoints members of the Expediency Council, which is a body and that relates and is within the parliament. He basically has control and appointment power over all key political offices within the regime. And this all flows from his claim to the divine right to rule. And again, this is different from Saudi Arabia, where it's a claim to a familial line of descent, a kind of royal family status, as opposed to a religious status. And so though there can be a role for Islam in both types of regime, Islam in a divine right to rule is only associated with the case of Iran and those theocratic authoritarian regimes that involve rule by religious figures and religious elites. And so that's a very small difference, but it's a very important difference that helps us to understand that the main issue here is leadership selection and the way that leaders are chosen. The fifth type of authoritarian regime is what we call sultanism. And this is a type of regime that is built around an individual and their family. It's usually a situation where one person or their family concentrates power and focuses on developing a cult of personality and obtaining a kind of glorification of the leader from the masses that is necessary to support them in the absence of any real effective legitimacy. Remember that legitimacy, when we discussed it with relation to the state, can take a few different forms. It can be charismatic, it can be rational legal, it can be traditional. In this case, there's virtually no legitimacy with the exception of some charismatic legitimacy that's associated with this cult of personality and this glorified leader. But that's a very, very thinly veiled sort of legitimacy. It's not much legitimacy, frankly, because there's no institutional foundation for the power that is often obtained by this leader. And so instead they have to create this personality and this glorification to support them. And this always takes place in the context of very limited institutionalization, meaning that there are very, very few rules or formal laws or systems that might guide the rule, whereas theocratic authoritarianism is very sophisticated and very complex in its institutional framework. Sultanism is very, very weakly institutionalized. There are virtually no rules regarding succession, leadership succession. There are limited rules regarding the relationships of other actors to the Sultan, often because other actors don't really exist. There's often little or no role for a legislature or parliament or courts. And to the extent that they do exist, those formal rules are a very poor guide. And so Sultanism is a bit different because it focuses so much more on a single person for their sake, as opposed to maybe their religious affiliation or elite status, or maybe their role in the military, or their relationship to a ruling party, and so on. So what we usually see are examples of leaders that don't really have a party or who are personalist in the sense that they rise above any institutions that might have a role in other types of authoritarian regimes. And so in Latin America, there's Rafael Trujillo from the Dominican Republic is a good example. In Nicaragua, there was the Somoza family. In Africa, there was Muammar Gaddafi. In Libya, excuse me. In Uganda, there was Idi Amin, who was notorious for being repressive and bizarre in his application of law. There was Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In Syria, the al-Assad family is an instance of a sultanistic regime. And in Asia, Saparmat Niyazov is another example from Turkmenistan. And so these are all leaders who didn't really have parties or who basically won their power through the creation of a cult of personality or the sort of singular focus on their own characteristics as the sort of guiding basis for rule. And very limited institutionalization, very few rules regarding succession or relationships, and formal rules are a very poor guide. So we can take a look at the case of Turkmenistan, which was part of the Soviet Union until 1991. And Saparmat Niyazov, that individual I just mentioned a moment ago, became the autocratic leader of this country until he died in 2006. And so over the course of 15 years, he did all sorts of bizarre things. He named cities, a theme park. He named the month of January after himself, and he even named a meteorite after himself. But it gets even more bizarre. He created an ice palace in the capital, which otherwise could not support an ice palace, a lake in the desert. He banned ballet and opera, and he banned beards and long hair for men. And so I would never make it in his Turkmenistan, and many of you wouldn't either, because if you enjoy ballet or opera, you couldn't spend any time there without growing impatient with those bizarre rules and laws. But all of this is what illustrates the nature of sultanism, just really ridiculous, bizarre laws, a limited role for any kind of institutionalization. It's all about this strange figure who often is able to solidify control through a whole series of interesting but but strange and unexpected decisions, banning theme parks or naming theme parks months after themselves, you name it. This is the essence of a sultanistic regime. There's really no rhyme or reason for much of this without maybe just reverting to the personality of the leader himself. And so it's all about that one person and all about the family that might support that person. Anna Martha says, some guy asked to Anastasia Somoza about his properties. His answer, yes, I have one Nicaragua. Absolutely, and that says it all. You know, like the idea that they possess and own everything, and that single individual and their personality is who is in charge. And it's not a religious authority. It's not a party-based authority. It's not an authority derived from a status as a military leader, and it's not anything really but what that individual decides for themselves. They can do in what the system should look like if it resembles their desire and their whim, and so on and so forth. So Turkmenistan is a good example. And if you go there, you'll see all sorts of bizarre stuff, like a monument of Niyazov that's made of pure gold. This is a huge monument that he had made during his rule. It wasn't made when he died. It was made while he was still alive. And so what's interesting is that usually monuments are created for figures after they pass away, so as to commemorate them, but he decided to commemorate himself while still alive. Obviously that goes to the sultanistic nature of the regime in this sort of cult of personality. There's also the Rukana, which is the book on Turkmen identity and history that Niyazov had a giant replica made of and put near the city center and the capital. This is something that is dear and important to the Turkmen nation. But the point that I want to make to you is that Niyazov used this and used this as a sort of cudgel, if you will, or he used this to harness the support of masses and legitimate his rule. He, in other words, kind of promoted a sense of nationalism or identity that would suit his regime and suit his hold on power. And so this is something you also see, though there is a role for that single personality. There's also kind of this effort by that individual to build the nation or to harness the support of masses who might identify with some set of ideas that leader can promote. Efren says, I was curious if Trump is headed towards this path. Efren, it's interesting. I don't know. I'd be curious to see what the rest of you all think. If Trump is headed towards a sultanistic type of regime where he bans ballet and long hair and beards for men, we'll have to wait and see if that happens. We'll have to wait and see what happens with the election first. But we'll take another look at another golden statue. It wasn't just one. He created a number of golden statues, but again, these weren't created after he died. He created them while he was in power. So he was commemorating his living self. And so this is an example of that sultanistic character of the regime, this cult of personality, this bizarre glorification of a leader who meant a great deal to himself and probably meant a great deal to Turkmen people as well, but only through the cultivation of this cult of personality that began with creating golden statues and putting them in parks and in city centers. And so this one is in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. I'm gonna take a look at the chat here. Anna Martha says, yes, Efren, he has several. Tower Trump. Alexa says, though I would not be surprised if Trump endorsed the construction of a golden statue of himself in DC. Well, he already has he has like one of those celebrities circles like in the street somewhere, but I think someone else made that for him. I don't know if he purchased that, although maybe I wouldn't be surprised. But that's a different thing for sure, I think, is Rady's pointing out. That means there's a lot of sultans in America. Kevin, could you explain? Pretty sure they revoked the star because it always gets destroyed. Yeah, I don't know. I just remember seeing some stuff on YouTube with people like destroying it and cleaning it. Caesar says it's been destroyed like 10 times, the Hollywood star. Yeah, the Hollywood star, that's it, sorry. there's quite a discussion going on here in the chat. Alexis says there was a toilet on that star. Kevin says actors and other various people that honor themselves. Okay, for sure, for sure. If one of those people rose to power and was able to develop a cult of personality, that would be very much like the Sultan that we mean when we talk about Niyazov and Somoza and others. Jorge says, I'm sure Trump wants to create something with his face in it. It seems like he only cares about himself. So this entire question of authoritarian rulers and types of regimes begs the question, how do they rule? And you might have the impression that these all-powerful leaders are truly all-powerful in that they in no way depend on anyone else who might support them. And that would be wrong. The fact is that often authoritarian rulers are more vulnerable politically than their counterparts in democracies. And the reason is because they don't rely on elections or electoral support or those more legitimate institutional processes for their power and their authority. Instead, they rely on the support normally of a narrow set of elites who form a coalition that supports the authoritarian regime. But what's important to keep in mind, and that we'll discuss, is that that coalition can revoke its support at any time. And it can also do so in a violent way that might involve a military coup or the ousting of that current dictator and their replacement with someone else. And so this absence of institutional processes means that these dictators are much more vulnerable, and it means that survival is much more difficult to come by in a dictatorship. The most important point that I need to make to you as we set out on the remainder of this discussion is that dictators cannot lead unilaterally. Banish that thought from your mind. They are not capable of ruling unilaterally. There's no one who is necessarily submitting to them and permitting them to rule over and above everyone else. In fact, they themselves are ruled by rules. And what we mean is that any dictator has to obey certain rules and certain realities and build certain kinds of support if they're going to remain in power. And if they don't build that support, and if they don't create that coalition, and if they don't maintain the satisfaction of that coalition, they will lose that support and they will fail to obey and conform to those rules that govern them and that will determine and dictate their survival in office. And so when we talk about a political regime and we talk about coalitions and support and the radius of the support for any political leader in any given circumstance, we can actually think about three dimensions of any political regime, be it a democratic regime or an authoritarian regime or any type of authoritarian regime that we just discussed. The three dimensions are, first, the nominal selectorate, and this is that group of people who have at least some legal say in choosing their leader. There's the real selectorate, and this is the group that actually chooses the leader. These are the influentials. And so like in the United States, any person who has at least some legal say in choosing their leader would be like any voter in a presidential election. The real selectorate might be like the Electoral College or those electors who cast votes in response putatively to the popular vote totals that come out of the election. The real selectorate is the group that actually chooses the leader. These are the influentials. The winning coalition is the people whose support is essential if a leader is to survive in office. And these are those individuals whose support cannot be lost. If you lose the support of those individuals, you will be removed from office because they can easily support someone else or shift their support and stand behind and line up behind some other potential ruler. And what's distinctive about authoritarian regimes is that the real selectorate, that is the influentials in the winning coalition, are both very small. And what that means is, while there are certain individuals whose support is absolutely essential for these dictators to stay in power, that group is relatively tiny. And that means then that there's a large pool of replacements or people who can sort of stand in or take the place of those influentials. This keeps the essentials off balance. This does favor the dictator because it means that they can easily replace those essential supporters with any of the replacements that might come from that large pool of potential replacements. What this means, though, is that the dictator has to find ways to support that narrow group of essentials that does exist. Even if those essentials are off balance, those small coalitions have to receive enormous benefits in the form of private rewards. We're talking about material rewards. And this is what encourages corruption within authoritarian regimes, because these coalitions are so small that it only makes sense to give benefits to the members of those small coalitions. And so you get lots and lots of corruption. You get handouts, you get cronyism, and you get any kind of behavior that involves abusing public office for private personal gain. And this is why authoritarian regimes are so corrupt, because the coalitions that support the dictator are very, very tiny. And the size of the coalition means that there's a need to use private rewards as opposed to public rewards, which would be shared by everyone. Now, in a democracy, by contrast, theoretically, it should be the case that there are large coalitions, and that those large coalitions of all potential voters would need to be satisfied with public rewards in the form of public policies that support the masses. But this is another way for us to distinguish between dictatorships and democracies in terms of the size of the coalitions, essentials, and the influentials. And what I want you to know and notice here is that this works two ways. You've got this small set of essentials and this small winning coalition, but because it's so small, like I said, they have to get a lot of rewards and a lot of benefits from the dictator in order for them to continue to support the dictator. If they don't get sufficiently paid off by that dictator, they can easily revoke their support, and they can easily bring down the entire authoritarian regime and even replace it with a democracy or just another dictator who might, more effectively purchase their loyalty. And so this is how we can both see authoritarian regimes as dependent on narrower sets of supporters, but also potentially even more vulnerable politically than elected leaders in democracies who often use public rewards to satisfy large coalitions. And this ties directly into Anna Martha's point from earlier in the class. Anna Martha said that it's possible that the winning coalition, those essentials, maybe in those swing states here in the United States, will support Donald Trump. And it could be that that winning coalition will carry him to victory. But if he doesn't win, he's not carried to victory, and he still tries to hang on to power, and the United States turns into a dictatorship, we're going to have a very different situation. If elections go by the wayside and no longer become relevant every 4 years, it could be a situation where Trump becomes a dictator and needs to assemble a small winning coalition and a small set of influentials, in which case Trump would need to use private rewards and would need to try to encourage the stability of those coalitions through corrupt practices like cronyism and favoritism. And that would be a world that would be very different than the world we find ourselves in today, which is still putatively democratic. This is a situation that could happen. It also could not happen, but the future is really unknown at this time. And the comments that he sometimes makes seem to suggest that he's willing to go down that path. And this raises a question that I want to put to you, which is, if Trump were to become a dictator, who would be in his winning coalition? Who would be those actors whose support would be essential if he were to stay in power? Can you think of who those actors might be? And granted, I'm acknowledging that we're doing some sort of alternative history here and we're thinking about all the possible outcomes. But I want to press this issue, and I want to think about our understanding of the situation and how we can use these perspectives and these concepts and these lenses to predict a potential future. Who do you think would be in that winning coalition? Who would be in Trump's winning coalition? Whose support would be essential?
What about the white elite?
The white elite?
Yes, I mean.
Yeah, maybe like business interests or like big property owners or people who like control a lot of the economy. Totally. Kevin says, I think it would last 1 week and everyone in Trump's cabinet that stayed would go down with him. Interesting. Joris says, Congress or the Supreme Court? Rady says, the Republican Party. I think Rady's onto something there. Yeah, probably the Republican Party elite, right? Who so far have been willing to enable him at really every step of the way. Joris says, Congress or the Supreme Court. I think that under most dictatorships, those formal political institutions that could represent a check on power and that don't distinguish between party become less relevant. So there's often a suspension of the Congress, or at a minimum, the ruling president will sort of favor a certain party, usually their own party, that supports them and lets them do what they want. Alejandro says the party would rule. Yeah, so, you know, the truth is, everyone, we're sort of in a situation that might lend itself to one party rule because of the tight link between Trump and the Republican Party. And you might disagree that that's a possibility, but the Republican Party has been increasingly willing to compromise democratic institutions in the name of the pursuit of power. And so I wouldn't put it past that party, just on like an objective basis, to sort of engage in this kind of thing. The party would rule, like Hitler. They will get dissolved first, then opposition parties, and so on, says Rady. So what we have then is, Anna Martha points out, it would probably be like the white elite, maybe, you know, big business interests who would maybe be part of that essential coalition, those essentials, that winning coalition. I think it also would be probably the Republican Party elite, those politicians within the Republican Party, like Mitch McConnell, for example. And though a ruling presidency in the United States would mean that Congress would lose power, would be weakened relative to that autocratic executive, there probably would still be a role for Mitch McConnell in the Senate to kind of rubber stamp and sort of help to try to legitimate the rule of that autocratic executive. Now, again, we're engaging in some sort of speculative history here, and we're kind of trying to imagine all the different paths that could be taken. But I think it's still useful for us to think about, well, who really makes the decisions, right? Who is really sort of behind the steering wheel in the situation, and who has influence that is so vital that if their support was revoked, the regime might collapse. These are the kinds of questions that we've got to answer for any type of regime that we encounter. Let's put aside the possibility of that authoritarian regime and just think about whose support is essential at present under our democratic regime that still exists, at least putatively. That is a very different coalition than would be the winning coalition were Trump to truly refuse to turn over power if he were defeated in the election. Kevin says, yeah, if they get the House and Supreme Court, then it will be just like FDR and a few other presidencies that had all three branches. But if he took over unjustifiably, it's up to Congress. If Congress goes with it and if the people go with it, but it is also important to take into account the people that will go with it. So as we close, there's also a possibility that states leave again. As we close, I think that the more important actor would be the military. The Congress would be powerless to do anything if Trump chose to remain in power. They are, after all, check and balance institutions that aren't above each other. It would often result in a crisis if there was a president who didn't leave power and the Congress was controlled by a different party. But in this case, really, truly speaking, the power broker would have to be the military, because the military has the monopoly of violence and has the guns. It has the capacity to use coercion and would have to be the one to remove him from power. And so that might be dissatisfying, but that might be satisfying as well, depending upon your perspective. But listen, everybody, this is the end of our discussion. And I'm so happy that you were here today to talk about these issues with me. I think that we did a really good job getting to the bottom of the question of democracy versus authoritarianism through the lens of contestation. We talked about the United States, we talked about other cases, and we talked about different types of authoritarian regime. And in the end, in the final analysis, we speculated about the different supporters of a potential authoritarian regime in this country, but also the possibility that the democratic institutions will hold and that will, perpetuate our democracy into the future. This will lead up to our new discussion next week, which will also focus on democracy and democratization, but more directly. And we'll begin with a conceptual discussion like always, and eventually we'll engage in an analysis that uses comparative methods. And so you are free to go if you don't have any comments or questions. I'm going to stop the recording right now, and I will stick around to answer your questions or take comments or talk about things with you. But thank you for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful day.